Hey everyone, welcome. We're going to talk about the EU CRA and Copyleft in this session. I think there's some shares. There says that these two are reserved for speakers, but since I'm up here, I guess those should be free as well. First of all, thank you for making your way across this entire conference venue just to make it here. It was quite a hike, at least I thought so. So thank you for making it to my talk. First of all, just a little show of hands. Who here is already familiar with the EU CRA? Wow, basically everyone. Cool. Then we can go easy on the background, which is good because I haven't prepared much background. I was sort of doing the bold assumption that if you turn up to a talk like this, you will be familiar with at least one of the two topics. Copyleft or the EU CRA. I see quite a few faces here who would be familiar with Copyleft as well. So, for those of you not familiar with me, my name is Jim Ahlberg. I work in the Ericsson Open Source Program Office as Director of Open Source Policy. My background is with law. So, trained as a lawyer, never really worked as one, more got dragged into technology because that was way more fun than law. But it's been sort of a useful background to the things I'm doing. So what is actually my job? Well, I'd say it's like a combination of things. It's partly I'm a lawyer, partly I'm a guardian of Ericsson's intellectual property assets and sort of our business, kind of a gardener in trying to create the right environments where we can do open source, where we can grow ecosystem, where we can grow openness. A bit of a translator both between engineering and legal, but trying to be that between engineering, legal, and business management as well, and trying to understand why does this thing that's open source make sense for us to do, both from a legal business perspective and an engineering perspective. Bit of a cultural anthropologist. Cultural anthropologist, that's a $10 word, if I ever heard one. Well, we're in Europe, so it's going to be a €10 word. But it's a fancy word. Basically, a cultural anthropologist, it's one of those brave people that go into the Amazon, they live with a tribe for 6 to 12 months, study their way of life, how they live, how society impacts their culture, and so forth. I'm not so adventurous. I don't like snakes. I don't like bugs. So I decided to study the tribe of software developers and open source engineers instead. Much safer and equally exciting. So to summarize like a little bit of who I am and what I do, I'm the dog in this picture. So I try to sort of be enough of an engineer to fit in, or at least sort of at the first glance fit in, enough of a lawyer to be able to talk to them, and sort of live in this world in between. And that's what I think makes the work around the Cyber Resiliency Act so much fun, and also so much of an headache, because it is this intersection between law, business, and engineering that we haven't really seen in the open source field before. Basically, I saw everyone raising their hands, but we can just do really, really quickly on the EU CRA. So everyone here already knew about it, but let me phrase the question in another way. Raise your hand if you think all your suppliers in your supply chain knows about the EU CRA. No hands. Cool. Yeah. Then we know where we stand with that, and the statement "the clock is ticking" applies to them as well, right? Because it does apply to all of your products with digital elements, and it's essentially CE marking for software. Fundamentally, it's about not shipping software with known vulnerabilities and the processes and documentation for getting there, and reporting vulnerabilities found, doing upstream fixes, shipping proper SBOMs, and most importantly, at least when we speak to business management, it's potentially very expensive if we don't comply with this. 2.5% of your global turnover, right? In our case, that would be about 6 billion euros. So not insignificant. I'd rather spend that money on something more fun. So to not do the whole, this is the CRA and basics of that, there's an excellent course by OpenSSF that I developed. I'd highly recommend anyone to take this one. There was also a great talk earlier today by our frenemies at Nokia about the CRA and 6 months in. Here we are. So, Ericsson, we're a telco company. What do we have to do with open source, right? It's traditionally seen as a fairly closed industry. So just to put into perspective some of the volumes of open source that goes into our products, if we look at last year, we ended up somewhere north of 32,000 new open source components being requested for introduction into Ericsson. A new component being only the top level, so we don't count the dependencies. We don't count sort of someone requesting something already come in. But it could be a new version of something we already have or something we really haven't seen before. So we have this exponential growth of open source components in our products. It's an incredibly important part of our supply chain. So for us, this is a matter close to our heart. But it is a journey getting people to understand sort of the link between CRA, open source, how this all fits in together, because the typical view would be, well, it's a supplier's problem, right? The supplier will have to conform to the CRA. Well, we don't really have a supplier in the case of CRA. So it leads us to what I'd like to call the CRA awareness curve. So you start here, denial phase. We're not really going to be impacted by the CRA, right? It's like we're either already so secure, we don't sell in Europe, or any number of reasons. Well, we're going to be taken out of that fairly soon and enter into the anchor stage and this is a really big risk, and why haven't we started already? Why is this happening to us? Why is bad things happening to good people, right? From that, you move on to the bargaining stage. Can we negotiate with the commission? These things seems harsh. No, sorry, that train passed way, way long ago. We were involved in doing that, and where we ended up, believe you me, it's actually not a bad thing where we are today compared to what it used to be, especially for open source. So no, we can't negotiate. Okay, one thing to do, lie down, pile on the floor, cry, we're screwed, right? Of course, that's not going to be the case, or hopefully that's not the case. I mean, you need to reach the end stage here, the acceptance stage of, okay, we need to be smart about it, develop strategies and processes for managing this, and make CRA an asset for us instead, and it's about doing the right thing after all. So hopefully you can get to this acceptance stage. I think myself, I've gone back and forth between the acceptance and depression stage quite a few times in this process. I expect I will continue to do that until and continuing after 2027. So we're going to look at one of the details of the CRA now that we framed it a little bit. So the detail I want us to focus on is here. Where manufacturers have developed a software or hardware modification to address the vulnerability in that component, they shall share the relevant code or documentation with the person or entity manufacturing or maintaining the component where appropriate in a machine-readable format. Okay. Seems simple enough. Okay, let's try to game this out just to see if there's any complications with this, right? So we have a vulnerability scenario here where we have a open source component. That component we discover has a vulnerability. We have this in our product. Okay, what's the next stage? Next stage is, have we developed a fix? Okay, if we have developed a fix, then we get to this point. And, if we haven't, it's just the obligation to report this to, like Collective would call the owner, either the manufacturer or maintainer of this. It's what you would need to report to if you haven't developed a fix. If you have, you need to ask yourself, is this under a permissive license or is this under a copyleft or reciprocal license? A typical example, not everyone might be into licenses. Not everyone is a nerd in that way. So think of GPL, right? Think of, is this a vulnerability in the Linux kernel, for example? So if it's the copyleft example, let's do the permissive one first. The permissive license, it doesn't impose any sort of its obligations on us downstream. So we could think that we're going to provide this downstream under either a proprietary license or the same permissive license or another permissive license. There's nothing preventing us from doing that. But if we get to the Copyleft example, and what it is that this patch may well be a derivative work of the original, meaning that this new work, this patch, also needs to be covered under the same original Copyleft license, because it is a dependent work upon the original. And in that case, we don't really have a choice in what license we apply to this upstream contribution that we, according to the CRA, are required to do. So in either case, would contribute that to the owner, right? Leads to an interesting question. What if there's a CLA in place with this project? If this project has a CLA and the explicit requirement, we don't accept contributions or communication with us unless you have signed the CLA or CCLA or whatever documentation they might have in place, right? That makes it tricky for me as a downstream user of that project. If I can't sign that CLA, there might be reasons why we can't accept those terms. They might be onerous. There might be, we might not in time get legal review on those terms. So gatekeeping it behind a CLA, I think it's questionable if that's going to be sort of maintainable over the long term, or if there's going to exist sort of a separate path where, you can fulfill your CRA obligations, email us this and we'll figure out the CLA later. But at least sort of you as a user have, provided, according to the CRA what you need. Okay. So significance of all of this. I think it's significant because it shifts the voluntary nature of a contribution. I would say companies, like, this is a bit cynical maybe, but companies contribute what they think benefits them. And they do it when they think it benefits them. Not to say that benefit can't be goodwill or that it's an ecosystem that functions better, but very few companies would be able to defend to their shareholders, we're going to do this because we think it's going to hurt us, right? That's not the story you can tell. There's a reason why it's beneficial for you to do that. It might be a huge benefit, might be a low benefit, but at least it's sort of, we would do it because we think it benefits us. With CRA, I think that slightly changes. Because no longer is that really an option. If what you have developed is a fix to an open source project, you need to provide that upstream. You don't really have a choice in the matter. And there's still plenty of good reasons why you'd want to contribute your fix, why you want to be in that control position, why you want to steer the project in a certain direction maybe. Because if this is a problem for you, maybe it's a problem for others as well. And let's face it, we much rather prefer they took our solution, right? Rather than someone else's, because that means more work for us. So I think that's a bit of a mind shift that needs to happen. And at least for some organizations, it will also require a rethink in the internal compliance processes necessary to make an open source contribution. Because that's no longer something you can say no to based on that we don't see the business motivation or we see other implications here. It's like, no, this is a legal requirement. We got to do this to meet the requirements, right? So that's one thing I think is interesting with this. And another question is, will this impact what free and open source software components companies select? I mean, then all of a sudden you get into security posturing, license, maybe CLA questions, CRA readiness of the project, the health of the project, and so forth. Basically, like, me as a manufacturer, will I be more likely to select everything else equal, right? Will I be more likely to select a project where I think CRA conformance will be easier for me? Yes. So I think that's slightly going to change the mindset of how we view these things. And if it's a copyleft license, I do think that's one of the things that's going to weigh into that decision. Because then we don't really have a choice. If we discover a bug here, if we develop a bug fix for it, we need to contribute under that license, right? So I do think that this will sort of impact the contribution policies of companies. Some companies do have policies of we don't contribute to GPL projects because we're afraid of certain exposure, or we don't contribute unless sort of we're pushing features, and any sort of policies. But I do think that will require a change for CRA conformance. And another question is, will this impact the manufacturer's policy of developing fixes? Will that, in some cases, be discouraged because you don't want to satisfy your obligation? I really don't hope that's the case, but we got to realize that that's a real possibility, right? If all the other structures this organization has in place doesn't support them making that contribution, then you're better off not developing that fix. Because then you can't, if you can't contribute it, you're in breach of your obligations under the CRA, and you're better off not having developed it in the first place, maybe, and relying on the community. So I think it's an interesting question, and we'll see how that plays out. Hopefully that worry is completely unfunded, and we can sort of all go on happily with our lives. So there's another interesting permission in the CRA that is remote data processing. So that means data processing at a distance for, and now I'm quoting law, for which the software is designed and developed by the manufacturer or under the responsibility of the manufacturer, and the absence of which would prevent the product with digital elements from performing one of its functions. I.e., let's do a stupid example. I have a car, but I don't have a key for my car. I can only start my car by an app. Okay, that app itself might not be a product with digital elements, but by the fact that the car that is a product with digital element is relying on my software as a service application to perform one of its basic functions, then that is also in scope. Then that software as a service offering is also in scope of it and subject to CRA. So in the context of Copyleft, this would mean that we now are one step closer to like an AGPL-ification, if you will, of the GPL license when applied here. Because all of a sudden, we're in this situation where we can't really, if this counts as remote data processing and it's thus subject to the CRA, it means that we need to provide SBOMs, which we didn't necessarily have to do if this was software as a service and not subject to the CRA, because we're actually not distributing anything. We may be required, or interesting discussion from someone in the audience who brought this up during an earlier session, is it a vulnerability if we don't do compliance, and if we're subject to a, for example, copyright infringement takedown of our product? Is that a security violation because we haven't distributed the GPL license the way we're supposed to, or the MIT license, right? So all that to say, I think we're going to have to step up in terms of compliance when it comes to software as a service if it's a product with digital elements under the EU CRA. And we're getting closer to a FARO or AGPL license style, where it makes the original GPL more like AGPL, actually, this law. So SaaS, in this case, it's not so much a shield to hide behind, because a lot more things will become much more similar in terms of open source compliance, but also security when you distribute a physical product. So I can do an example of this. This is an Ericsson product that we sell. It's a router. It's great. I can do most things, manage it by accessing it in its local interface, but we also have an excellent companion app to this, where you can manage a large amount of routers if you need to manage 100 or 200 routers. So this is one example I would view where, and this is just my opinion, it's not sort of for future reference, this may or may not be a product with digital elements, we'll see, right? But that caveat aside, the first one, physical product put on the EU market, no question about it, it's a product with digital element and CRA applies. But this application, it has certain features that I can't really get to, or if I can, my colleagues will tell me I'm stupid after this event and tell me you can certainly access that if you do it this way. But say that I want to manage like 100 routers, and that's a core function of this, that you can easily configure that, but I need to use the application. That would put this application sort of also being equal to a product with digital elements and would need to be treated so. And does put completely different requirements on, SBOM, vulnerability management, all the things under the CRA that is required for that. So, more details on the EU CRA. How we're doing on time? Good. So some more details here, right? Because if we were back to the same original text that we discussed before, Article 13.6, and there's one part here that I think is interesting that we could talk about, and that is they shall share the relevant code or documentation. Okay, so what does this mean for our hypothetical company that may not want to contribute under GPL, for example, or maybe unable to do so? Would it be sufficient? We have gone through this entire cycle again, come to the conclusion it's an open source license. It's GPL, for example. Okay, maybe I don't want to be a contributor to this GPL project for whatever reason, right? There might be valid reasons, there might be stupid reasons, but let's just assume I have a valid reason for not wanting to do that. Is it sufficient for me to fulfill my CRA obligations by providing documentation that would outline my fix and saying, well, here it is. This is pseudocode, or this is, documenting the problem, and, it could implement this and problem would be solved. This is outlined how we did it. I'm not sure. I think that in a way there's a discussion, does this need clarification? Should we ask for clarification? In my mind, I think there might actually be some cases where it's reasonable not to provide a code, and that might be if that sort of would divulge some trade secrets, if that would sort of divulge some things that are covered under NDA, either because you're part of a research collaboration with someone, or it's simply not yours to give away. Then this might be sort of an option of last resort, if you will. I do, however, think that it really, if this is valid, if you could do it this way, I really do think that it should be an option of last resort. And I think the market, if you will kind of regulate that itself. Because if I were an open source project, I would get tired of that real quick, right? I'd want code under the original license that I can use. I don't want you to provide the documentation, or I don't want you to give me this under a proprietary license. But if we have to look at the text of the law, and I haven't seen anything in sort of the standardization work that would imply otherwise, I mean, it's entirely okay for me to, provide, if we go back here, just do what it says, share the relevant code with you. Okay, I shared the relevant code with you. It doesn't say that you necessarily have to be able to use that. I might provide it to you under an incompatible license. I might provide it to you under no license at all. It's just like, here's the fix. You're not allowed to use it, but at least you see it. Right? I think that kind of behavior will probably be self-policed in the sense that, might be tolerated once or twice. And as said, sometimes people might have a good reason for doing it that way. But I think sort of projects in general will much prefer sort of if they get usable code, right? That leaves us with this whole thing of, like, essential to this is contributing to open source is no longer voluntary. It's a requirement. But how do you satisfy that requirement? It's somewhat, open here. We have, at least if we look here, we would have 4 different alternatives. We could provide it under the code under a proprietary license. We could provide it under the same or another permissive license, if that's what its original license was. We could, if it's a Copyleft license, we could, either do it as derivative work or documentation, or then you don't really have any other options at the point of the Copyleft, because it travels with the code, right? So, bit of a brain dump before we move into, we called it Q&A. I expect it to be more of a discussion, to be honest. That's typically how it is when we talk CRA, which is a good thing. So, CLAs, and these are just broad questions to the audience. Can you have a policy that one needs to be signed before contributions happens due to the CRA? I mean, surely maybe projects can have them, but maybe that is something that would gatekeep an organization like mine from using that. unless we sort of, okay, we know that we have signed this, or we know that we are fine with this. But it does add an extra step and an extra sort of worry that what if we find a vulnerability? What if we have a fix for it and we can't contribute because there's something in the CLA we don't like, or we can't sign, or we can't even find sort of the person authorized to sign within sort of an appropriate time. And you would think that, it would be very easy to find someone who can sign paper for a company. It's not sometimes. Sometimes that's a really hard part, to figure out who is allowed to sign for these things. So that's a question. Will open source projects that have CLA and are under a Copyleft license be further disadvantaged compared to projects without? Or will they say, well, we really don't want to put our users in a bad position, so we're going to provide for this alternate path of fulfilling your obligations under EU CRA, and just provide it to us and we'll work out CLA later. Abandoned projects, they face another interesting part, right? Because yes, we have provided to the email address or to the GitHub account indicated here our fix. But, where does that release us from our obligation? Is it when we know they did it? Is it when we sent the email? Then it's up to them. I think we have a view on that in a bit. For me, that's something I'd like to understand more. What is the actual policy? What's my organization's policy on that? There's plenty of good reasons why maybe you shouldn't use an abandoned project anyway, but we probably all have those in our code bases somewhere, right? And sometimes they just work. They're perfect. It's no need to fix what's not broken. But maybe this will lead to that a lot of abandoned projects will be forked publicly, so that at least it's possible to fulfill the obligation if it's important projects, maybe. Is there any implied responsibility from the receiving party of fixes? So if you're a project or a maintainer, do you have any obligations to the provider of the fix? Probably not. I mean, there's no corresponding obligation for you to say, thank you, I love this fix, it works perfectly, I'm going to integrate it. Because it might be shit, let's be honest. Most things we get might not work, or they might require tweaking. So there's no obligation for you as a project to pick these things up and integrate them. It's like they're there for your convenience. You can take them if they're provided to you under a license where you can do that. And you can integrate them if you want. That's up to you as a project. So there's no one forcing you to integrate the fixes that you get, or any specific fix that you get. I think this is also an interesting question to the manufacturers among us in the supply chain. What would we actually like to see from projects? Contact emails, I think that's sort of a good first start. Recipient verification, it's like, hey, we have received your fix, thank you very much. We may or may not use it. I know that would make some people that I talk to very sort of calm, like, okay, they got it, we're released from our obligation at least, and we can verify that. Because then we have verification material showing that we have done what we're supposed to do, they have received it, and that's without question. Are there other things that we would like to see? Personally, I would be all for sort of having a voluntary badge on your GitHub page ranking from, yes, I have a very high posturing on this, and I'm going to do like everything in my power to make CRA conformance easy for my users, to I really don't care about this project, don't bother me about it, right? And have that range. Because what that would at least do is I wouldn't bother the projects to tell me, don't bother me about this. I'm not gonna answer emails, I'm not gonna spend a lot of resources on this. Okay, good. I don't have to bother them. There's probably a few of them that start out with very high ambitions, and that goes down over time. But that's fine, right? And you will still have lots of them that don't have a badging, but at least in my view, okay, that puts you kind of in the category of don't bother me about this. And then I know what I can expect. And I can sort of make the decision to use or not use this project based on one more data point. And project per project, that's probably pretty useless. But if you aggregate, what did we say, 34,000 new components each year, then that starts to sort of add up in terms of actually providing some value or savings for an organization. So some potential issues in this space. What if you discover a vulnerability in some open source software under a Copyleft license, but you have discovered that in a collaboration where you have an exclusivity agreement with your customer, or under you're doing custom development for that customer. Okay, well, the copyright is this customer, but I have this vulnerability in my products as well, and I have developed a fix in this project. So am I obliged to upstream that? Possibly, but it's not your copyright to do. So we might have a clash there. I don't really have a solution for that, except that it's probably a good thing to take into account with current customer agreements already now, to start thinking about, well, let's carve out that we might need to fulfill CRA obligations in this. Yes, it's your stuff, but let's carve that out. Joint ownership of results in R&D collaboration. You might say, well, we developed this product 50-50. We all put in equal amount of resources. We own this 50-50, all the IP, all the copyright, because we can't separate who wrote what line of code in this. Okay, then typically you would need the other party's consent before contributing a fix, or before doing anything with that copyright and that IP. So if we are in this situation where, like, I have developed a fix, I would like to contribute it because I have this other project that's depending on it and where I'm subject to these rules, and the other guy says, no, that's my IP and I will not allow that. I mean, that puts you in a rock and a hard place. Hopefully, well, we'll get to that later, but that's one scenario where that could be issues, right? Copyright patents, maybe even trademarks that are co-owned, could cause these kind of issues, right? I think it's interesting to ask if the CRA, under some conditions, is a mandatory royalty-free patent licensing regime. Probably, maybe that's a can of worms not to open, but I do think it's interesting because some of the licenses, they do have patent licensing provisions where that's tied to at least your contribution. And if your contribution, or rather if your fix implements some of your patents that you would have preferred to keep out of this project, which I think that's legitimate, that's fine, then you're now under obligation to royalty-free license this IP. I think that's something at least some patent-owning companies need to consider. And another question is, and we touched upon this before, is your key manufacturer suppliers ready for the CRA? Because if they're not, then you are in the hole for that. It doesn't matter if we come to December 2027 and, my suppliers tell me, well, I can't conform to the CRA, I can't give you a CE marked product, and I'm going to elect not to do that. Well, likely the indemnity and warranty I would have in that agreement probably not going to cover my cost of not being able to ship my product to my customers. That's sort of typically how a value chain works, right? So that is a big issue, because if you talk to sourcing, they might be, well, we got liabilities and indemnities in this contract, it's fine. Like, if they can't deliver, we'll meet that. Well, that doesn't help with all the trust that was broken with customers, with the penalties we need to pay. And if there's just a small part of our delivery, typically, they might have a multiple of the contract value as the maximum damages they're required to pay, like say 3, 5, 15 times. Still, that might not cover your actual losses. So typically a good thing to try to partner with suppliers on this and like, hey, we're in this together and we really need you to be conformant with this, because otherwise we can't sell products. And if we can't sell products, we can't buy stuff from you. And if we can't buy stuff from you, that's going to be bad for you. So good to have that conversation. Okay, so solutions. Talk to your customers and partners. That solves sort of the co-ownership and that someone else might be owning the IP while you're stuck with the CRA obligations. The flaw in that plan is that sort of requires your customers to be reasonable, or people in general to be reasonable. As a lawyer, I'm very happy that people aren't reasonable, because that provides me with full employment. But there might be the odd case where that's an issue. Another question, this is mostly for lawyers, is abiding by applicable law clauses sufficient in your agreement? probably that should cover most of the cases in Europe. But if you have, for example, US suppliers delivering into your US units, they further develop this and put that into a product or an internal product that goes on to the European market. Less certain that the obvious interpretation of the abiding by all applicable law clause would cover European law if sort of all the involved parties in that agreement were the US entities. And what if a fix is developed in the US, but the open source software is also deployed with the same vulnerability in Europe, or you discover a vulnerability in the US, but you have the same sort of obligation in Europe? I mean, it's not necessarily so in a large organization that the US entity will know to tell, all right, now I need to tell my European colleagues that I've discovered something that's applicable under this European legislation for them. So solution to that is probably building building reporting structures internally that sort of would cover all of these situations to ensure that, well, it doesn't matter if we discover something in the US or if we develop a fix in the US. It's like the whole company should work in the same way to ensure that we are conformant to the CRA to avoid this liability. Another interesting question is can one require an NDA to be signed along with the code being provided upstream? Say that you do have trade secrets, or you do have stuff that you really, for one reason or another, don't want to show, or it's the only way to make the copyright owner or the partners you have comfortable with you sharing with the project. Maybe that's fine. I don't think that it in each and every situation would be inappropriate. I do think that we're back to this self-regulating market. I think someone who acts like this repeatedly will not be the most popular person at these kinds of events, right? And at the end of the day, you want to have a certain influence on these projects. That's why we do things. We want our code accepted, not for some ego trip, but economically it makes sense, right? Let's see, how are we doing on time? We have 3 more minutes. I didn't expect it to take this long. Okay, and can one provide documentation instead? That's sort of the final part of this. I think we have time for 1 or 2 quick questions, maybe, before someone comes and rips me off the stage. Yes?
You mentioned that the requirement is to provide the fix upstream.
Yep.
And we talked about CLAs and how that will interact. But I didn't see any requirement in the legislation you quoted that says that upstream has to accept the fix.
Nope.
So if there's a CLA and I provide a fix and send them that to the email address that's listed in the security.txt file, without signing the CLA, they may not accept that, but would that be mindful in that case?
I don't know. And that's, I would think that, yes, you probably have fulfilled your obligation under the CRA. If that's going to be the preferred method or not, I would much rather prefer we didn't have that uncertainty, right? That would also have the somewhat unintended consequence of killing CLAs, which I don't like anyway, so for me it's perfect.
If the contribution is done in a manner which the maintainer or steward legally cannot accept, for example, it's done with a patent clause that is incompatible with the existing project, then it wasn't really a contribution.
But you have provided your fix. The fact that it's going to be interesting, right? I think the preferred method is very much going to be that you provide it in a way where it's actually usable for them, but we're going to have these corner cases.
Well, quite a central case.
Yeah. Yes?
Is providing a fix upstream that addresses the vulnerability, but neuters the functionality acceptable?
Well, there's no obligation on the project to accept your contribution again. So I would say that is acceptable. Maybe it's not great behavior, but it's like you provided the fix you had, it solved your problem, and you have provided it. It creates 10 new bugs, okay, but then it's up to the project to say, well, we're not going to accept this. Thank you, but no thank you. But you have at least provided what you have. I don't think you have an obligation to always, if it doesn't break anything in your product, I don't think you have an obligation that goes beyond, providing your fix. I don't think you can be expected to also fix all potential downstream bugs that will occur from this. Because that would be sort of logical conclusion of going down that path, that you're not allowed to break anything else.
Create another security issue from that.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, that's up to the project. They need to look at this and say, well, maybe this part of it was a good idea, this part not so much. We'll take this part, thank you very much, and we'll not implement it exactly as you contributed it. Yes.
Small question or comment on the abandoned project.
Yeah.
The manufacturer is one ultimately responsible. So the choice today to use an abandoned project or after December 2027, still the manufacturer is responsible for it. How do you see that changing? You mentioned you might send the notice of the vulnerability or fix to someone, but there's no one there to respond.
I mean,
But you're still responsible.
yeah, I mean, my preferred solution to that is, okay, I seem to care about this project, I will spin up a public fork of this.
Great.
That's the way I see to sort of, I can both take care of my CRA obligations, we can ensure the longevity of this project. Sure, that comes with a cost, but it's not a greater cost than carrying this vulnerability in internal fork would have been.
I think that would satisfy it.
Yeah. Maybe one last question, and then someone is probably going to drag me off this stage because I think we're like 1 minute over time. Okay. Okay, good. So until that gentleman comes and drags me off the stage, we're good.
So I'd like to provide some food for thought here on the documentation or code providing. Interestingly enough, in the English version it says relevant code or documentation. I checked two other versions in different languages, and there they have it split, relevant code or relevant documentation. So just some food for thought though.
Interesting. In the Swedish version, it's pretty much the same as the English one.
Interesting. In the German one, they actually split them, for example.
German's very precise.
Translations, it's not guaranteed. Maybe a slight info.
It's not a perfect science. Okay, I will hand off to Thomas, who's apparently next.